Late last winter, Morgan found herself in a crumbling apartment that sat at the end of a dimly lit hallway. Rent was cheap, which was all she could afford after moving to a new city for work. The building's online reviews had been mediocre, but it seemed livable until she moved in. Almost immediately, there was a strange sensation. The air felt dense. The shadows in her apartment always seemed to linger just a second too long, and there was a damp, moldy smell that seeped from the walls, despite the place appearing spotless. The neighbors were quiet, though, which she appreciated. Most of the other tenants were elderly, keeping mostly to themselves. One night, Morgan awoke suddenly, her sheets damp with sweat to the sound of faint scratching. The noise seemed to be coming from within the walls, traveling slowly around her bedroom. Figuring it was some sort of animal or maybe faulty plumbing, she tried to ignore it. But as she lay there in the dark, it grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to echo throughout the room. She pulled the blankets over her head, pressing her hands to her ears until, finally, it stopped. The following morning, she reported it to the building manager, an older woman named Mrs. Yates, who looked at her with something close to pity. "You're in apartment 14D, right?" she asked. When Morgan nodded, Mrs. Yates sighed. "We've had complaints before, but nothing we could ever really fix. They're just old pipes, I'm sure," she assured Morgan, with a tight smile that seemed anything but reassuring. Over the next few days, the noises continued. Every night, around 3 a.m., the scratching would start, followed by the sensation of something watching her. She found herself waking up, staring wide-eyed into the darkness, convinced that someone or something was in the room with her. She even began to see movement out of the corner of her eye, fleeting shadows near the corners, as if they were waiting for her to look away. One night, as she was brushing her teeth, she noticed something scrawled faintly in the mirror's fogged-up surface. "Help me." Her hands shook as she wiped it away, convincing herself it was some trick of the steam. But the next night, it reappeared. This time the letters were clearer, more defined. "They're here." Desperate, Morgan turned to her few neighbors for answers, but they avoided her questions, giving her strained, sympathetic looks. One elderly man finally spoke to her, glancing around nervously as if someone might overhear. He told her about a young woman, Lila, who had once lived in her apartment years ago. Lila had been a quiet tenant who rarely spoke to anyone until she began telling neighbors about things in the walls. "We all thought she was losing her mind," he whispered, voice trembling. "But then, she just disappeared." Morgan, her unease growing, asked if anyone knew what had happened to Lila, but the old man had only shrugged. "One day she was just gone," he said, looking away as if remembering something terrible. No one heard from her again. That night, when the scratching started, it sounded louder, angrier. It wasn't just coming from the walls anymore, it was coming from beneath her bed, from inside her closet. She could hear faint whispers threading through the darkness, fragmented as if they were being spoken from far away. "Get out! They're watching. Please." The voices were frantic, pleading, and she felt the weight of their desperation sink into her bones. Unable to take it anymore, she grabbed her flashlight, determined to investigate. As she moved through the dark apartment, the air seemed to grow colder, the shadows twisting unnaturally around her. She crouched down, flashing the light under her bed. At first, there was nothing, but as she shifted, her flashlight beam landed on something pale and skeletal lying in the shadows, a bone-thin hand, curled and lifeless. She screamed, scrambling back, but when she looked again, the hand was gone. She barely slept that night, clutching a kitchen knife in one hand, her flashlight in the other. By morning, she was ready to pack her things and leave, but curiosity mixed with a lingering dread compelled her to stay for one more night, hoping somehow she'd find answers. That evening, she did some research and found a single article buried deep in local news archives. The article confirmed what the old man had told her. A young woman named Lila had gone missing a decade ago. Her landlord claimed she had just left one night. But the article mentioned something else. Police had found strange markings on her apartment walls, claw marks gouged deep into the plaster as though someone had been frantically trying to escape. That night, as Morgan lay in bed, every nerve on edge, she felt a sudden, overwhelming heaviness pressing down on her chest, like invisible hands pushing her into the mattress. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The room grew colder, the shadows deeper, and in that suffocating silence, she heard a soft voice, whispering, desperate, right by her ear. "Help me." Don't let them take me. The grip loosened just enough for her to bolt upright, gasping, her body drenched in cold sweat. The apartment was dark, silent, but her heart pounded, and the shadows seemed to pulse around her, as if they were alive. She could feel something watching her from the darkness, waiting. In her panic, she flicked on every light in the apartment, illuminating every corner. But as she looked around, her eyes fell on her own reflection in the bathroom mirror. Written in smeared, dripping letters were the words, "You're next." She never slept in that apartment again. By the next morning, she was gone, leaving her belongings behind, fleeing without a single backward glance. To this day, she refuses to speak of what happened in 14D, but every once in a while, she wakes up at exactly 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, convinced she hears scratching sounds echoing through the walls. There was a small old apartment complex just outside the city, tucked into a quiet, secluded area where no one ever lingered. It was a place people moved into out of necessity, never by choice. The rent was cheap, the hallways dimly lit, and the building itself seemed to sag under the weight of the years it had seen. Anyone who moved in would quickly start counting the days until they could leave. That was until they realized how hard it was to leave. Sasha was one of those people. She'd moved in after a breakup, taking the first place she could afford. Her unit was on the top floor with windows that looked out at the blank side of the next building. Nothing to see, nothing to distract her, which was fine. She wanted to be alone. But as the days stretched into weeks, she began to feel a creeping sense of unease. Something about the apartment was off. The first strange thing she noticed was the sound of footsteps. They started softly at night, somewhere above her ceiling, heavy and purposeful. But she was on the top floor. There shouldn't have been anyone above her. She mentioned it to the building manager, a frail old man named Mr. Lyle, who just gave her a strange look and muttered, "It's an old building. It has a life of its own." Sasha laughed it off, chalking it up to the building settling. But she noticed how his eyes shifted when he said it. The footsteps came every night after that, right around 2 a.m. Thump, thump, thump. They'd start in the hallway and slowly make their way above her bedroom, pacing, pausing every so often as if listening. Sometimes she could almost feel it, a strange heaviness above her bed, like someone pressing down from the other side of the ceiling. The footsteps stopped abruptly each night, leaving her lying there, holding her breath until morning. One evening, exhausted from sleepless nights, she heard something new, a faint, muffled voice, like someone crying, almost begging. She pressed her ear to the wall, trying to make out the words, but they were too faint, too distorted, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. She convinced herself it was a neighbor with a television on, but the sound lingered, like a whisper pressing against her skull. The next morning, she brought it up with Mr. Lyle, who simply looked past her, eyes glazed, muttering, "You'd better keep to yourself in this place. It doesn't like nosy people." That night, she could hear the voice again, clearer now. It sounded like it was coming from the other side of her bedroom wall, trembling, pleading. She got out of bed, heart pounding, and pressed her ear to the wall. The voice was unmistakably human, whispering, "Help? Please, it's coming." The plea sent chills down her spine, and she yanked herself away from the wall. The crying was gone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, something close. She spent the rest of the night sitting up, her back against the bed, clutching her phone in her hand as if it would protect her. Over the next week, she noticed other strange things. Her phone screen would flicker and die randomly, and when it powered back up, her photos and messages were gone. Once, while she was brushing her teeth, she saw her reflection blink, even though she hadn't. She stared at the mirror, waiting for it to happen again, but nothing did. Yet every time she walked past the mirror, she felt something else looking back. Then came the night when the footsteps entered her apartment. She'd heard the familiar thumping in the hallway, slow and heavy, getting closer to her door. But this time, there was a metallic click as her door unlocked. Sasha froze, watching her bedroom door, which had slowly creaked open by itself. A figure stepped into the room, shadowed, its form barely discernible in the dark, but she could feel its eyes, cold, piercing, watching her. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped. The figure moved closer, its face hollow, eyes dark and empty, until it was standing right next to her bed, looking down at her. "Help me," it whispered, its voice raw and inhuman, a mix of pleading and something else, anger. Its face twisted as if in pain or rage. And then, without warning, it lunged at her. Sasha jolted awake, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. The room was empty, the door closed, but the memory of that face was seared into her mind. She couldn't shake it. It felt too real, too close. She barely slept the rest of the night, waiting for the footsteps to return. The following morning, she stumbled into Mr. Lyle's office, demanding answers. She told him everything, her voice shaking, begging him to explain what was happening. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and fear. "They say this place keeps things," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "It feeds on the people who stay too long, the ones who get too curious. It holds on to them, keeps them trapped." Sasha's hands trembled. Trapped? What does that even mean? Mr. Lyle leaned in, his face pale. "There are people who lived here years ago. Tenants who were never seen again. People who couldn't leave." His voice dropped even lower. "It keeps them here, in the walls, in the shadows. And sometimes they try to reach out, but they're changed." That night, Sasha packed her things, barely able to stay in the apartment long enough to throw her belongings into bags. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, every shadow stretching out, waiting to grab her if she lingered. As she pulled the last bag into the hallway, she looked back, just once. She saw the faint outline of a figure standing at her bedroom window, staring back at her. Its mouth was moving, whispering something she couldn't hear, but she knew it was calling her back, begging her to stay. She left, running down the stairs, never once looking back. A week later, she found another place across the city, far away from the building. But every so often, she'd glance at her mirror and swear she saw that same figure, watching her, pleading, just waiting for her to listen. The nightmares didn't stop either. She'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps above her ceiling, pacing, pausing, and listening. Ben moved into the old apartment on Baker Street at the end of summer, thinking it would be a fresh start. The building was worn with chipped paint and narrow hallways that always seemed to smell faintly of mildew, but it was cheap, and he didn't mind the quirks. What he minded were the oddities that started happening almost immediately. It began with the mail. He'd come home to find old, yellowed letters sitting on his doorstep, addressed to a Miss Lila Park, who, as far as he knew, hadn't lived there in years. The letters were strangely worded, filled with phrases like, "We're waiting," and "You'll understand soon." After weeks of the strange deliveries, he confronted the building manager about it. But the manager just looked at him strangely and said no one by that name had lived there in a very long time. Ben laughed it off, but he noticed how the manager's eyes lingered on him, as if there was more he wasn't saying. A few nights later, Ben was jolted awake by an intense cold spreading across his room, so cold he could see his own breath. The air was thick, almost like a fog, and he had the eerie sense that he wasn't alone. He scanned the dark room, heart pounding, and saw something that made him freeze, a faint outline of a figure standing at the end of his bed. It looked like a woman, but her features were blurred, and her eyes were dark, hollow pits that seemed to pull him in. Before he could scream, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but the lingering chill in the room. He tried to tell himself it was just a dream, but over the next few days, the strange occurrences grew worse. Objects in his apartment started moving on their own. One night, he watched in horror as his toothbrush slid across the bathroom sink, stopping right at the edge and pointing toward him, almost as if it had been placed there by someone else. One evening, he came home to find a note scrawled in red ink on his bathroom mirror. "Let me in." He backed away, his hands shaking, but just as he turned to leave, he noticed something else. The old yellowed letters on his kitchen counter had multiplied. There were dozens of them now, all with that same strange handwriting, and all addressed to Miss Lila Park. This time, however, the letters weren't unopened. They were already torn open, and each one contained a single line in the same jagged handwriting. "Why did you leave me?" The nights became unbearable. Every night around 3 a.m., he'd hear whispers coming from his closet. Sometimes they were faint, pleading whispers. Other times they were angry, hissing sounds that grew louder until he had to leave the apartment and spend the night pacing the lobby. Desperate, Ben started looking into the history of the building. After hours of digging, he found an article mentioning a woman named Lila Park who had vanished from his apartment decades ago. Neighbors had reported hearing her scream in the middle of the night, but by the time anyone checked on her, she was gone, leaving only claw marks on the walls and strange letters scattered across the floor. The police had never found her body, and her case was unsolved. That night, Ben's dreams were filled with images of her, a woman with hollow eyes reaching out, her fingers sharp, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. He woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air, only to find his apartment filled with an acrid, decaying smell. He gagged, stumbling to his feet, when he heard something unmistakable coming from his closet, the faint sound of scratching. It grew louder, as if something were clawing its way through the walls. And then came the whispers, frantic and angry, pleading with him. "Why did you leave me? Why did you forget me?" Panicked, he swung open the closet door, hoping it would stop. But inside, the walls were covered in scratch marks, deep, furious gouges that hadn't been there before. And scrawled across the wall in what looked like dried blood were the words, "Let me out." Ben stumbled backward, tripping over something soft. When he looked down, he saw a dusty, torn dress lying on the floor. He stared, heart racing, recognizing the dress from the photos he'd found of Lila. He tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat as he realized he wasn't alone. Behind him, he could feel something cold, something heavy in the air. Slowly, he turned, and there she was. Lila, her hollow eyes filled with rage, her face twisted, staring at him from the shadows. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out, as if she were trapped between worlds, her words unable to reach him. But he could hear her thoughts, piercing through his mind, repeating over and over, "You took my place. You're here because of me." In a moment of sheer terror, Ben realized the truth. Lila had never left. She was still here, trapped, waiting for someone to take her place, someone who would understand the horrors she'd endured. And he was that someone. In his final moments in that apartment, all Ben could feel was her cold breath on his neck, her fingers wrapping around his shoulders, pulling him into the darkness. And the last thing he heard before his world faded to black was her voice, low and menacing, whispering in his ear, "Welcome home." Days later, the building manager placed an eviction notice on Ben's door. It hung there, untouched, for weeks until a new tenant finally moved in. The manager watched as they unpacked, his face expressionless, and turned to leave, whispering softly to himself as he closed the door. Another tenant, another story, and the cycle would begin again. The building kept its secrets well, and so did the people it held within its walls. Amy moved into her apartment after an exhausting search for affordable rent in the city. It was an old building in an area that had once been busy but now sat half abandoned, cloaked in a quiet, eerie silence. She noticed right away that the building seemed oddly alive. The walls creaked, the air felt stale, and her apartment was always just a little too cold, no matter how high she turned up the heat. The floorboards groaned beneath her feet, and the windows never fully closed, allowing the sound of wind to seep through, filling her space with a soft, ghostly whistle. On her first night, Amy was woken up by the sound of what she thought was someone pacing in her living room. She froze, listening in the darkness, but the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they'd started. Telling herself it was the building settling, she drifted back to sleep. The next morning, she found a dusty handprint on her living room window. It was small, like a child's handprint, and it left streaks as if someone had dragged their fingers down the glass. She wiped it away, but the eerie feeling lingered. She figured maybe it was from the last tenant, some forgotten mark left behind. That night, Amy heard the footsteps again, pacing softly back and forth. This time they sounded slower, heavier, like someone was dragging themselves across the floor. She sat up in bed, holding her breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped again, but then, ever so softly, she heard a child's voice whispering, "Come and play." Her blood ran cold. Amy didn't move for the rest of the night, lying there with her heart pounding until dawn. As days turned into weeks, strange things kept happening. She'd come home to find small objects out of place. A fork on the bathroom counter, books rearranged on her shelf, lights she knew she'd turned off flickering back on. One day, she returned to find her hallway lined with her shoes, arranged neatly, one after the other, leading from her door to her bedroom. She stared at them, too terrified to touch them, her mind racing. It had to be a prank, she told herself. Someone in the building had to have a key. But when she asked her landlord, he insisted that no one else had access to her apartment. One night, she decided she'd had enough. She grabbed her phone and called a friend, explaining everything in a hushed whisper. Her friend agreed to stay on the line with her, trying to calm her down. Amy walked around her apartment, describing each eerie detail, trying to reassure herself that she wasn't going crazy. Then, just as she reached her bedroom, she heard it again. The child's voice, soft and clear, whispering, "Come and play." Her friend heard it too. There was a gasp on the other end of the line, followed by silence. Amy dropped the phone and turned, scanning the dark room, but it was empty. She picked the phone back up, her hands shaking, but her friend had already hung up. That night, as she lay in bed, her room plunged into darkness. She heard a sound that chilled her to the bone, the slow creak of her closet door opening. She held her breath, too terrified to move. Through the tiny crack in the door, she saw a pair of small, pale eyes staring back at her, unblinking, fixed on her from the shadows. She scrambled out of bed, flicked on the light, but the closet was empty. The door was wide open, the clothes hanging there swaying gently as if they'd just been disturbed. But there was no one there, no sign that anyone or anything had been hiding in her closet. She slammed the door shut and shoved a chair in front of it, vowing to leave the apartment in the morning. As she lay there, heart racing, she heard the whisper again, closer this time. "I'm waiting." The words sounded wrong, twisted as if they were coming from some place that didn't belong to this world. Amy clenched her fists, forcing herself to ignore it, trying desperately to fall asleep. But the air around her felt thick, almost oppressive, and the temperature dropped until her breath came out in puffs of mist. At some point in the early hours, she must have drifted off, because she was woken by a strange, suffocating pressure on her chest. She opened her eyes to find herself pinned down, unable to move. Hovering above her, she saw a child, gaunt, hollow-eyed, with skin the color of ash and a mouth stretched in a chilling, unnatural smile. The child's head tilted, staring at her with a mix of anger and longing. "Stay with me," it whispered, leaning close, so close she could feel its icy breath on her face. Amy tried to scream, but no sound came out. The child's small, cold hands pressed harder into her chest, and she felt the room darken, her vision blurring as the life drained out of her. Just as she felt herself slipping away, the pressure suddenly lifted, and she bolted upright, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. By morning, Amy was packed and ready to leave. She didn't even bother notifying her landlord. She just grabbed her things and bolted. But as she turned to take one last look at the apartment, she felt an overwhelming urge to go back, to stay. Her heart ached and she felt tears welling up, though she didn't know why. Pushing through the strange feeling, she rushed down the stairs and out of the building, vowing never to return. Weeks passed, and Amy started to feel a little better. She found a new apartment across town and tried to put the experience behind her. But every once in a while, she'd hear a soft, childlike giggle in her new apartment, or find things rearranged, like someone had been there, waiting. Then one night, she heard the whisper again, clear as day, coming from the corner of her room. "I found you." Amy turned slowly, her blood running cold, and there in the shadows stood the same child, eyes dark and hollow with that same chilling smile. And before everything went black, she heard it whisper one last time, "Now you'll never leave." Jared was running out of time. After losing his job, he took the first apartment he could find, an old, dimly lit place on the edge of town. The rent was ridiculously low, almost suspiciously so, but he was desperate, and the landlord hadn't asked many questions. "Just keep to yourself," the landlord had said with an odd smile as he handed Jared the keys. The first night, Jared noticed how eerily silent the building was. No street noise, no neighbors, no sounds of life anywhere. Just silence, heavy and pressing, as if the building itself were holding its breath. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange, creeping sense of dread that he couldn't quite place. Then came the whispers. They started as faint murmurs, barely audible, like the rustle of pages turning. He'd been lying in bed when he first heard them. Soft voices coming from the walls, from the floor surrounding him. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but as the nights wore on, they grew louder, more insistent. "Get out. Leave. Run." The voices would hiss in low, distorted tones. They sounded desperate, terrified, warning him of something he couldn't understand. He mentioned it to the landlord the next day, but the man just laughed it off, saying, "It's an old building. You'll get used to it." Jared noticed the way the landlord's eyes darted away, though, as if he was avoiding something. Over the next few nights, things only got worse. The voices grew louder, sometimes filling the room with a chorus of overlapping whispers, their tones urgent, pleading. He couldn't understand all of them, but he could feel their fear, could feel their desperation. And then there were the shadows, flickers of movement in the corners of his eyes, shapes that seemed to melt into the darkness when he turned to look. One night, he woke to the sensation of someone standing over him. His room was pitch dark, but he could make out a faint shape, a figure, tall and looming, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. He tried to move, to scream, but he was frozen, paralyzed as the figure leaned closer, close enough that he could feel its cold breath against his face. "Don't stay here," it whispered in a low, guttural voice, and then it vanished, leaving him gasping for air, drenched in cold sweat. Jared wanted to leave, but he was trapped by his own desperation. He had nowhere else to go, no money to afford a new place. So he stayed, hoping the horrors would stop, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then one night, everything changed. It was a little past midnight when he heard it, a faint knocking coming from the closet door. He lay still, hoping it would stop, but the knocking continued, growing louder, more insistent. Heart pounding, he got up, his hands trembling as he reached for the closet door. He told himself it was probably a rat or maybe just the old wood settling. But when he opened the door, he found something far worse. There was a stairwell, narrow and dark, leading down into a basement he hadn't known existed. The air wafting up was damp and stale, filled with a strange metallic smell. Against his better judgment, he took a step down, clutching his phone as a flashlight, telling himself he'd only go as far as the first step, just to make sure there wasn't anyone down there. But the moment he stepped onto the stairs, he felt an invisible force behind him, almost like a hand pressing gently on his back, urging him forward. He tried to stop, but his feet kept moving, taking one step after another, drawn deeper into the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a small, cold room with walls covered in peeling wallpaper and floors thick with dust. The smell was stronger here, sharp and sickly sweet. And in the center of the room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A circle of old, faded photographs laid carefully on the floor. Each one showed a different tenant, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. And there in the center was a single photograph of him, taken from an angle that could only have been from his bedroom door. A low hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to resonate deep within his chest. He backed away, heart hammering, but as he turned to leave, he saw them. Dozens of figures, pale and hollow-eyed, standing in the shadows around him, their faces twisted with grief and rage. Their mouths moved silently, forming words he couldn't hear, but he understood their meaning. He had taken their place. They were trapped here, bound to the apartment, unable to leave. And now, so was he. Panicking, he bolted for the stairs, but no matter how fast he ran, the exit seemed to stretch farther and farther away. The hallway twisted, the walls closing in around him until he was stumbling in darkness, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could feel them behind him, the cold hands reaching out, brushing his shoulders, tugging at his clothes, trying to pull him back. In his final moments, he heard the voices again, louder this time, clear and desperate. "Run. Get out. Don't stay here." But it was too late. The darkness swallowed him, pulling him into the building's twisted, silent embrace. Days passed, and when the landlord found the apartment abandoned, he simply shrugged, made a note, and prepared it for the next tenant. As he walked out, he glanced over his shoulder just once at the shadow standing by the window, staring back at him with empty eyes, its mouth moving silently as if trying to scream. Emily was thrilled to find the apartment, a top-floor unit in a historic building downtown. The rent was surprisingly low, and it had a charming vintage feel, creaky wooden floors, stained glass windows, and an antique chandelier hanging in the living room. She signed the lease the same day she saw it, moving in quickly with boxes and a sense of adventure. But on her first night, she noticed something odd. The neighbors were silent. She'd thought a building like this would be alive with sound. Doors creaking, distant conversations, the muffled hum of a television through the walls. But there was nothing. only a heavy, unnatural quiet that hung in the air like fog. At night, she could almost feel it pressing in on her. A week after she moved in, Emily began hearing noises. It was always around midnight, a soft, rhythmic thudding coming from above her bedroom ceiling. She tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to some late-night repairs in the attic, but it never stopped. Every night, like clockwork, the sound returned, and it didn't sound like construction. It sounded deliberate, like something moving across the floor, something being dragged. Curiosity got the better of her, and one evening she asked the building manager about it. He looked at her, face pale and eyes weary, and muttered something about the attic being empty, that no one had used it in years. He told her not to go up there, warned her, in fact, with an odd, trembling tone, that the attic was best left alone. But that only made her more determined to see it for herself. The next night, when the noises started again, she grabbed her flashlight and headed up the narrow stairway at the end of the hall. Her footsteps echoed in the empty stairwell, and a thick, musty smell hung in the air, growing stronger as she ascended. When she reached the attic door, she found it unlocked, despite the manager's claim that no one ever went up there. She pushed it open, and a wave of stale air hit her. Inside, the attic was dark, with a single, narrow window casting a dim glow over the room. Dust coated every surface, thick and undisturbed, but something immediately caught her attention. A set of large wooden crates lined up against the far wall. Curiosity turning to dread, she approached the crates, noticing how the air seemed colder near them, how the silence deepened. She opened the first crate, her flashlight illuminating what looked like a collection of old belongings. A cracked hand mirror, a tattered dress, a dusty old doll with one eye missing. She felt a shiver crawl up her spine as she moved on to the second crate. Inside were more objects, stranger this time. A bundle of old, brittle letters, tied with a ribbon, a faded photograph of a young woman in a 1920s dress, her face etched with sadness. Emily felt as if she were intruding on something private, something forgotten and left here intentionally. But when she opened the third crate, her flashlight flickered and she froze. Inside was a tangle of thick, dark hair, twisted and matted, and beneath it was a collection of teeth, each one yellowed and cracked. The flashlight slipped from her hand, and she stumbled back, tripping over something soft. Looking down, she saw what looked like a shoe, a small red child's shoe, covered in dust, but unmistakably recent. It didn't fit with the other objects, as if someone had placed it there recently. Before she could process what she'd found, the attic door swung shut with a loud bang, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking, but it wouldn't turn on. Panic surged as she stumbled toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. Something was holding it closed from the other side. And then she heard it, the soft, dragging sound that had haunted her nights. Only this time, it was coming from inside the attic. Her breath hitched as she turned, straining her eyes to see in the dim light. There, emerging from the far corner, was a shadow, crawling across the floor on hands and knees. She couldn't make out a face, only the outline of a figure, dragging itself slowly toward her, the sound of nails scratching against the wood, a hoarse whisper echoing in the silent room. "Why did you open it?" The voice was raspy, broken, filled with anger. Emily's heart hammered as she backed against the door, pounding on it, desperate to escape, but the figure kept coming, closer and closer, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, its empty, hollow eyes fixed on her. "Why did you open it?" it repeated, louder this time, the whisper turning into a guttural scream that filled the attic, bouncing off the walls, piercing her ears. She shut her eyes, feeling tears streaming down her face, and screamed as loud as she could. The air grew colder, the shadows around her darkened, and just as she felt the figure's icy breath on her face, the door behind her burst open, and she fell backward into the hallway, gasping for air. She looked up to see the building manager, his face pale and drawn, staring down at her with something like pity. "I told you not to go up there," he said quietly, his voice shaking. "You shouldn't have disturbed her." Emily didn't ask questions. She packed her things that night and left the apartment, leaving behind everything she couldn't carry. But the haunting didn't stop when she left. Everywhere she went, she heard the dragging sound, the same rhythmic thud, and every so often, when she turned out the lights, she'd see them, shadows in the corners, crawling toward her, whispering, "Why did you open it?" It was supposed to be a fresh start. Mike had been through a rough year, so when he found an ad for a cheap, secluded apartment in a renovated warehouse, he jumped at the chance. The ad had been vague, simply describing it as a quiet escape with plenty of character. When he arrived, the building manager, a thin, jittery man with darting eyes, warned him about two things. Don't go near the basement and keep all windows closed at night. Mike shrugged it off as old building superstition, eager to settle in and put his past behind him. On his first night, he quickly noticed that the apartment was unusually cold. Even with the heater on full blast, a chill seeped through the walls. But it was the silence that was most unsettling. It was a total, almost oppressive silence that felt unnatural for a building this large. Not a single creak, no wind through the vents, no hum of pipes, just an endless, hollow stillness. By his third night, strange things began to happen. As he lay in bed, he would hear faint whispers, unintelligible murmurs coming from the walls. At first he thought it was the neighbors or maybe just the pipes, but the whispers always came from the same corner of his bedroom. They were soft, just barely out of reach, growing louder only when he closed his eyes. One night he couldn't take it anymore. He approached the corner and pressed his ear to the wall, hoping to figure out what, if anything, was on the other side. As soon as his ear touched the wall, the whispers stopped, leaving him in total silence. He sighed with relief, ready to go back to bed, when suddenly he felt it, a faint, cold breath against his ear, followed by a whisper so clear it made his skin crawl. "Help me." Mike stumbled back, heart pounding, his mind racing to make sense of it. He tried to laugh it off as an overactive imagination, but he could still feel that icy breath lingering on his skin. The whisper haunted him, echoing in his mind even after he managed to fall asleep. The next night, he locked his bedroom door, hoping it would give him some peace. But in the dead of night, he woke to the feeling of someone watching him. The room was dark, but he sensed movement, a faint shadow stretching across the wall. His eyes adjusted, and there at the foot of his bed stood a figure, a woman with long, tangled hair, her eyes hollow and dark, her face contorted in an expression of pain and fear. Before he could react, she spoke in a choked, desperate whisper. "Don't open the window." The words sent a chill down his spine, and then, just like that, she was gone. He lay there, paralyzed with fear, trying to convince himself it was a nightmare. But her warning echoed in his mind, and he found himself unable to shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences continued. Sometimes he would find damp footprints leading from his bed to the window, stopping just before the glass. Other times he'd hear the faint sound of sobbing coming from the apartment above him, except there was no apartment above him, only the roof. He tried asking the building manager about it, but every time he brought it up, the manager would go pale and quickly change the subject. One evening, after another sleepless night, Mike couldn't take it anymore. He decided to investigate the basement. Maybe he'd find something that would explain all of this. As he approached the basement door, he noticed a faint smell of damp earth, thick and musty, seeping from the crack under the door. The basement was dark, with only a single bulb flickering above the staircase. As he descended, the air grew colder, the silence heavier. At the bottom, he found a series of old rooms, filled with dust-covered furniture and forgotten belongings. But as he walked through, he noticed something odd, a single wet footprint leading deeper into the shadows. He followed it, heart racing, until he came to a small room at the very back. The door was ajar, and inside he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the center of the room was a large, full-length mirror, and in its reflection he saw the woman again, standing just behind him, her eyes pleading, her mouth moving silently, as if screaming for help. He spun around, but the room was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, she was gone. Panicking, he ran back up the stairs, determined to leave the building and never look back. But as he reached the top, he found himself facing the building manager, who stood blocking his path. "You went to the basement, didn't you?" The manager whispered, his eyes filled with something between fear and pity. "You let her in." "Then, what are you talking about?" Mike asked, desperate for answers. "She was never supposed to leave that room," the manager replied. "We tried to keep her contained. We tried to warn you. Now she's free, and she'll never leave you alone." Mike shoved past him, racing back to his apartment, heart pounding. When he locked the door behind him, he found the room freezing, even colder than before, and then he noticed it. The window, wide open, the icy air flooding in. And there in the corner was the woman, her hollow eyes fixed on him, a thin smile stretching across her face as she whispered, "Thank you for letting me in." The last thing he saw was her hand reaching out toward him, her fingers impossibly cold as the room went dark. A month later, a new tenant moved in. The building manager handed him the keys with a forced smile and reminded him of the same rules. Don't go near the basement, and keep the windows closed at night. As the tenant turned to leave, the manager glanced back at the building, where a faint shadow stood in the window, watching him with hollow eyes. Evelyn moved into the building because it seemed like the perfect place to begin a new chapter. Her apartment was small but cozy, with tall windows that let in the morning light and high ceilings that gave it an airy, open feel. But something felt off from the very first night. It was an unease she couldn't place, a sense that she wasn't alone. The hallways always felt colder than they should, even with the heat blasting, and at night, she often felt as though she was being watched. The strange occurrences began subtly. Every morning, she would wake up to find her front door unlocked. She was sure she locked it before going to bed, even double-checking sometimes, but by morning, it would always be open, just a crack. Her keys would often be in a different spot, sometimes in odd places like her bathroom sink or by her bedroom window. She thought maybe she was just scatterbrained from the stress of the move. One night, she heard a noise coming from the hallway just outside her door, a faint scratching sound, almost like an animal clawing at the floor. It was soft, but persistent. She pressed her ear to the door, listening. The scratching stopped, and in the silence, she could have sworn she heard a low whisper, a voice muffled by the wood, but unmistakably there, saying, "Let me in." Chilled, she stepped back and locked the door again, even putting a chair under the handle for good measure. Then there were the footsteps. Around midnight, she would pacing up and down the hallway just outside her apartment, slow, shuffling steps that stopped just short of her door, then continued down the hall before circling back. When she finally gathered the courage to look through the peephole, there was no one there. But as soon as she went back to bed, the footsteps would start again, dragging along the floor, always stopping right outside her door. One night, when the footsteps stopped outside her apartment, she called out, "Who's there?" Silence. And then, after a long pause, a voice replied. It was a whisper, a low rasp that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. "Help me. Please. Let me in." She felt a chill crawl down her spine and backed away from the door. Whoever it was, they didn't knock or try to force their way in. They just waited, whispering faintly, repeating the same words, "Let me in. Let me in." Evelyn spent the next few days in a state of paranoia. She barely slept, jumping at every sound, every creak of the old building. She tried talking to her neighbors, but no one wanted to discuss it. Most of them just looked at her strangely and muttered something about old building noises. Then, one afternoon, she ran into an elderly woman who lived a few doors down. The woman took one look at Evelyn's tired face and sighed, shaking her head. "You've heard it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Evelyn nodded, desperate for answers. "Who is it? Why do they keep asking to come in?" The woman looked away as if searching for the right words. "A long time ago, there was someone who lived in that apartment. A young man, quiet, kept to himself. He vanished one winter, no note, no goodbye. But some say he didn't leave. They say his spirit wanders the building now, trying to find a way back inside." Evelyn shivered. "So he's a ghost?" "Whatever he is," the woman said, "he's been out there ever since. He can't come in unless you let him, so don't, no matter what he says. Once you let him in, he'll never leave." Evelyn thanked the woman, her mind racing, trying to make sense of it. That night, she locked the door as tightly as she could, stacking every heavy item she could find against it. But the footsteps returned, slow and steady, stopping just outside her door. She lay awake, listening, feeling the air grow cold as his whispers seeped through the wood. "Let me in. Please, let me in." The whispers continued night after night, growing more insistent, more desperate. Some nights she would hear scratching at the door, as though he was trying to claw his way in. And each night his voice grew louder, filled with rage, with sorrow, with a desperation that seemed to claw at her own heart. One night she woke up to find her bedroom door open. She was certain she'd closed it before bed. She bolted upright, heart racing, scanning the room in the darkness. And then she heard it, the soft whisper coming from just behind her, inches from her ear. "Thank you for letting me in." Paralyzed with fear, she felt a cold hand rest on her shoulder, the grip tightening. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She was frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. As he leaned closer, his face just a shadow in the dark that ended, whispering into her ear, "I've been waiting so long." From that night on, Evelyn was never truly alone in the apartment. She would see flickers of movement in the mirrors, catch glimpses of a shadowy figure standing in the corners of her vision, hear soft breathing behind her as she tried to sleep. The door was never locked in the mornings anymore. It was always wide open, as if to let someone come and go as they pleased. She thought about leaving, but something held her back, some strange compulsion, a cold, clawing fear that if she left, he would follow. And sometimes late at night when she was lying in bed, she could hear him pacing, whispering softly to himself, "I'm home, finally home." Jared's new apartment was cheap, maybe too cheap. It was an old high-rise with worn-out carpets, flickering hallway lights, and neighbors who barely made eye contact. But rent was low, and after a tough few months, he wasn't going to complain. Besides, the place had a certain charm. Large windows overlooking the city, tall ceilings, and a quietness he found comforting. It didn't take long for things to get strange. On his first night, Jared woke up around 3 a.m. to the distinct sound of someone whispering his name. It was faint, almost like the hum of a distant conversation just out of reach. His bedroom window was open, letting in a cool draft, and he assumed it was just the wind or a stray sound from the street below. But as he lay back down, the whisper came again, soft and closer. "Jared, Jared." He sat up, his heart pounding, straining to listen. But there was nothing, only silence. Over the next few days, he noticed other oddities. Every morning, the window he'd closed the night before would be open again, letting in the cold, damp air. He tried locking it, checking it twice, even stuffing the sill with old rags to keep it shut, but no matter what he did, the window was always open in the morning. He told himself it was probably just a draft, maybe a broken latch, though he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then one night, the whispering returned. This time, it was louder, a murmur that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. "Jared, let me in." The voice was raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. He felt a chill crawl over him and turned on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with light. The whispering stopped instantly, and for a moment the room felt warm and safe again. But then he noticed something odd. On the fogged-up window, there were handprints, small, childlike, with long, spindly fingers pressed against the glass, as though someone had been standing just outside, looking in. His stomach twisted. He lived on the 8th floor. No one could have reached his window. He tried to brush it off as a prank, but the image of those handprints haunted him. And as the days passed, things grew worse. The whispers started following him into other rooms. Sometimes he'd hear them in the bathroom while he was brushing his teeth. Faint murmurs from the vent, pleading, "Let me in." Other times, they'd come from the hallway, a faint, beckoning sound as he sat on the couch, the voice growing angrier when he ignored it. One night, after a particularly long day, Jared decided he'd had enough. He was going to open the window, prove to himself there was nothing there, and put an end to this nonsense. He marched over, unlocked the latch, and yanked it open. But instead of the cool night air, he was greeted by silence, an unnatural, suffocating silence that filled the room like a thick fog. And in the dark reflection of the glass, he saw her. A woman's face, pale and hollow, with sunken eyes and thin, cracked lips, stared back at him from the other side. Her hair hung in wet, tangled clumps, and her eyes, they were black, endless pools of darkness that seemed to draw him in. "Finally," she whispered, her lips barely moving. "Finally, you let me in." Jared stumbled back, heart pounding as the figure in the window moved forward, crossing into his apartment. Her body was twisted, broken, her limbs bending at unnatural angles as she crawled through the frame, inching closer, her eyes locked on him with a hunger that made his blood run cold. He tried to run, but his body felt frozen, paralyzed as her bony fingers reached out, touching his face, cold as ice. She leaned in, her breath freezing against his skin, as she whispered, "I've been waiting for you." The last thing he remembered was her hand pressing over his eyes, pulling him into darkness. Days later, the landlord entered the apartment after Jared's employer reported him missing. The place was eerily quiet, and the only sign of Jared was a faint, lingering chill in the air. The landlord found the window wide open, despite the icy winter wind that had crept into the room, frosting the edges of the glass. And on the inside of the window, there were fresh handprints, small and childlike, pressed against the glass. Only this time, they were on the inside, as though something had finally found its way in.